They cast her out for defending a Navy SEAL. But within 24 hours, an unexpected visitor altered everything. Sarah Martinez had always believed in doing what was right, even when it meant standing alone. As the senior nurse at Mercy General Hospital, she had earned respect through 15 years of dedication and compassion. Her colleagues knew her as someone who would fight for her patients no matter the cost. The trouble began on a rainy Tuesday morning when Marcus Thompson was wheeled into the emergency room. The 34-year-old Navy SEAL had been involved in a motorcycle accident during his leave, and his injuries were severe. Multiple fractures, internal bleeding, and a head trauma that left him unconscious. What made the situation complicated was not his medical condition, but the circumstances surrounding his accident. Marcus had been riding through downtown when a drunk driver ran a red light and slammed into him. The driver happened to be the son of City Councilman Richard Blackwood, one of the most influential politicians in the city. Within hours of the accident, rumors began spreading through the hospital corridors. Some staff members whispered that Marcus had been drinking too, that maybe he was at fault. Others suggested that the whole incident was being blown out of proportion. Dr. Patricia Henley, the hospital administrator, called an emergency meeting with the senior staff. She made it clear that the hospital needed to be careful about how they handled this case. The Blackwood family had donated millions to the hospital over the years, and Councilman Blackwood was pushing for a new wing to be built. Any negative publicity could jeopardize future funding. Sarah sat in that meeting feeling increasingly uncomfortable as her colleagues nodded along with Dr. Henley's suggestions. The administrator hinted that perhaps the medical records could be reviewed more carefully, that maybe some details about Marcus's condition could be kept private. She spoke about the importance of maintaining good relationships with influential families in the community. When Sarah raised her hand to speak, the room fell silent. She looked around at faces she had worked alongside for years, people she had considered friends. Her voice was steady but firm as she addressed the room. She reminded everyone of their oath to do no harm, to treat all patients equally regardless of their background or the politics surrounding their case. She pointed out that Marcus Thompson had served his country with honor and deserved the same level of care and advocacy as any other patient. The reaction was immediate and hostile. Dr. Henley's face reddened as she told Sarah that she was being naive about how the real world worked. Other doctors and nurses began to distance themselves from her position, arguing that they had to think about the bigger picture and the hospital's future. Some accused her of being grandstanding, of putting her personal beliefs above the institution's needs. As the days passed, Sarah found herself increasingly isolated. Colleagues who had once sought her advice now avoided eye contact in the hallways. Her patient assignments were quietly shifted to less critical cases. The whispers followed her everywhere she went, and she could feel the weight of disapproval from people she had once called friends. The breaking point came when she discovered that someone had altered Marcus's medical chart. Key details about his blood alcohol level, which had been 0 at the time of the accident, had been mysteriously changed. Test results that clearly showed he had not been under the influence were missing from his file. When she brought this to Dr. Henley's attention, she was told that she was overreacting and that the records were being handled appropriately by the legal department. Sarah knew she had a choice to make. She could stay silent, keep her job, and maintain the comfortable life she had built over the years, or she could continue to fight for what she believed was right, knowing that it might cost her everything. The decision, when it came, felt inevitable. She had not become a nurse to compromise her values when it mattered most. That evening, she made copies of the original medical records before they could be permanently altered. She documented the changes that had been made and prepared a detailed report of everything she had witnessed. She knew that once she took this step, there would be no going back. Her career at Mercy General would be over, and word would spread throughout the medical community. Other hospitals might be reluctant to hire someone who had been labeled a troublemaker. The next morning, Sarah submitted her report to the state medical board and contacted the local newspaper. She provided them with evidence of the cover-up and spoke openly about the pressure she had faced to stay silent. She also reached out to Marcus's family, who had been kept in the dark about many details of his case. The response from the hospital was swift and brutal. Dr. Henley called her into the office and informed her that her services were no longer needed. Security escorted her from the building as her former colleagues watched from windows and doorways. Some looked ashamed, Others seemed relieved that the source of their discomfort was being removed. Sarah walked to her car carrying a cardboard box containing 15 years of memories and achievements, knowing that she had done the right thing but feeling utterly alone in the world. The news of Sarah's firing spread through the city like wildfire. The local newspaper ran her story on the front page, detailing the alleged cover-up at Mercy General Hospital and the pressure she had faced to remain silent about Marcus Thompson's case. The headline read, "Nurse loses job after exposing hospital cover-up of Navy SEALs accident." Within hours, Sarah's phone was ringing constantly. Some calls were from supporters who praised her courage, while others were angry voices accusing her of being a traitor to her own workplace. The hospital's board of directors issued a statement claiming that Sarah had been terminated for insubordination and unprofessional conduct, not for any whistleblowing activities. They painted her as a disgruntled employee who had violated patient confidentiality and hospital protocols. The smear campaign against Sarah was relentless. Anonymous sources began feeding information to competing news outlets, suggesting that she had a history of being difficult to work with and had previously clashed with administration over minor issues. Her personal life was scrutinized, with reporters digging into her background and interviewing former colleagues who were willing to speak against her. Dr. Henley appeared on the local morning show, speaking in carefully measured tones about the difficulty of managing hospital staff who refused to follow proper procedures. She expressed sympathy for Sarah's passion, but suggested that emotion should never override institutional wisdom and legal requirements. The hospital's legal team had clearly coached her well, as she managed to sound both reasonable and concerned while systematically destroying Sarah's reputation. Meanwhile, Marcus Thompson remained unconscious in the intensive care unit, unaware of the controversy swirling around his case. His family had been informed of Sarah's allegations, but they were struggling to understand the full implications while dealing with their own emotional trauma. His sister, Jennifer, tried to get answers from the hospital staff, but she found herself facing a wall of professional politeness that revealed nothing useful. Sarah spent her days at home, watching the news coverage and feeling increasingly isolated. Friends from outside the medical community offered their support, but many of her professional relationships had evaporated overnight. She discovered that several nursing positions she had applied for were mysteriously no longer available once her identity became known to potential employers. The financial pressure was immediate and crushing. Without her hospital salary, Sarah struggled to pay her mortgage and cover basic living expenses. She had some savings, but legal fees were mounting as she consulted with attorneys about potential retaliation lawsuits. The lawyers warned her that fighting powerful institutions, like hospitals and city government, could be a long and expensive process with no guarantee of success. Social media became both a battleground and a source of unexpected support. A hashtag emerged supporting her actions, but it was countered by equally vocal critics who accused her of seeking attention and harming the reputation of healthcare workers everywhere. The comments sections of news articles became vicious, with people taking sides based on their political beliefs rather than the facts of the case. The stress began taking a physical toll on Sarah's health. She found herself unable to sleep, replaying conversations and decisions over and over in her mind. She questioned whether she had handled the situation correctly, whether there might have been a way to protect Marcus without destroying her own career. The isolation was perhaps the worst part, as she realized how few people were willing to stand with her when it really mattered. One evening, while scrolling through the endless stream of social media comments about her case, Sarah came across a message that stopped her cold. It was from a woman named Carol Henderson, who claimed to be the widow of a veteran who had died under suspicious circumstances at another hospital several years earlier. Carol wrote that she had tried to get answers about her husband's death, but had been stonewalled by the medical establishment. She thanked Sarah for having the courage to speak out and suggested that this case might be part of a larger pattern. This message led Sarah down a rabbit hole of research into medical cover-ups involving veterans and service members. She discovered forums where families shared stories of loved ones who had received substandard care or had their cases mishandled due to political or financial considerations. The pattern was disturbing, suggesting that Marcus's situation was not an isolated incident but part of a systemic problem. As Sarah delved deeper into these stories, she began to understand that her decision to speak out had implications far beyond her own career or even Marcus's case. She was potentially exposing a network of corruption that had harmed numerous veterans and their families. This realization gave her a new sense of purpose, even as her personal situation continued to deteriorate. The weight of responsibility was overwhelming. Sarah realized that she had not just lost her job, but had potentially placed herself at the center of a much larger fight against institutional corruption. She wondered if she had the strength to see it through, especially as the forces arrayed against her seemed to grow more powerful each day. The question that kept her awake at night was whether one person could really make a difference against such entrenched opposition. 3 weeks after her termination, Sarah's life had settled into a grim routine of job applications, legal consultations, and sleepless nights. The media attention had largely moved on to other stories, leaving her feeling forgotten and abandoned by the public that had initially rallied to her cause. Bills were piling up on her kitchen table, and she had begun considering selling her house to cover mounting expenses. The isolation was becoming unbearable. Former colleagues crossed the street to avoid her when she went into town. The grocery store clerks who had once made friendly conversation now served her in uncomfortable silence. Even her neighbor, Mrs. Peterson, who had always been kind, now avoided eye contact when they encountered each other in the yard. Sarah's sister called daily from across the country, offering to help financially and begging her to move away and start over somewhere else. The temptation was strong, but Sarah felt an obligation to see Marcus's case through to whatever conclusion awaited. She had started something that was bigger than herself, and abandoning it now felt like betraying everyone who had suffered in silence. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Dr. James Morrison, a physician who had worked at Mercy General for over 20 years, contacted Sarah through a secure email account. He had been following her case closely and had been struggling with his own conscience about things he had witnessed over the years. Morrison had kept quiet about questionable practices because he had a family to support and a reputation to maintain. But Sarah's courage had inspired him to reconsider his silence. Morrison revealed that the corruption at Mercy General went far deeper than Marcus's case. He provided Sarah with information about a pattern of preferential treatment for wealthy donors and politically connected families, while veterans and low-income patients received substandard care. Medical records had been altered before, test results had been manipulated, and whistleblowers had been systematically silenced through intimidation and career destruction. The doctor also shared a crucial piece of information about Marcus's case specifically. He had been present during the initial examination and had personally witnessed the original blood test results that clearly showed Marcus had not been drinking. He had copies of the authentic medical records hidden in a secure location and was willing to testify about what he had seen. But he needed protection for his own family before he could come forward publicly. Sarah realized that Morrison's testimony could be the key to not only vindicating her own actions but also exposing the broader corruption at the hospital. However, she also understood the enormous risk he was taking and the personal cost he would face if he came forward. She spent hours on the phone with him, discussing the potential consequences and trying to ensure that he was fully prepared for what lay ahead. Meanwhile, Marcus Thompson had begun showing signs of improvement. He was drifting in and out of consciousness, and doctors were cautiously optimistic about his recovery. His sister Jennifer had become increasingly suspicious about the hospital's handling of his case, especially after learning about the discrepancies Sarah had discovered. She began asking more pointed questions and demanding to see all of his medical records. The pressure was mounting on the hospital administration from multiple directions. The state medical board had launched an investigation based on Sarah's complaint, and they were requesting access to original documents and witness interviews. The newspaper continued to investigate the story, uncovering additional instances where the hospital had shown favoritism to influential families. Public opinion was slowly shifting as more details emerged about the institution's practices. Councilman Blackwood, whose son had caused the accident, found himself under increasing scrutiny as well. Opposition politicians began questioning his influence over city contracts and his relationship with various healthcare institutions. The accident that had initially seemed like it would be quietly swept under the rug was becoming a major political liability for one of the city's most powerful figures, Sarah. watched these developments with a mixture of hope and anxiety. Each new revelation vindicated her decision to speak out, but she also knew that powerful people were now actively working to discredit her and anyone who supported her cause. She received threatening phone calls at odd hours, and strange cars began appearing on her street at night. Whether these incidents were related to her case or simply the product of her heightened anxiety, she could not be sure. The psychological toll was severe. Sarah found herself questioning every decision, second-guessing every conversation, and wondering if she had been naive to think that one person could challenge such entrenched corruption. The support she received from strangers online was encouraging, but it could not compensate for the loss of her professional community and the financial security she had worked so hard to build. As the investigation continued, Sarah realized that she was no longer fighting just for Marcus Thompson, or even for her own reputation. She was fighting for the principle that healthcare should be based on medical need rather than political influence, and that those who serve their country deserve the same quality of care as anyone else. The weight of this responsibility was enormous, but it also gave her the strength to continue when everything else seemed hopeless. The morning of the fourth week brought news that changed everything. Marcus Thompson had regained full consciousness and was asking questions about what had happened to him. More importantly, he was asking specifically about Sarah Martinez, the nurse whose story he had heard about from his sister Jennifer. His recovery was progressing faster than doctors had expected, and his memory of the events leading up to the accident was completely intact. When Jennifer told him about Sarah's sacrifice and the battle she had been fighting on his behalf, Marcus was deeply moved. Despite his injuries and ongoing recovery, he insisted on speaking with Sarah directly. The phone call between them was emotional, with Marcus expressing his gratitude for her willingness to stand up for him when no one else would. He told her that he had experienced discrimination before as a veteran, but nothing as blatant as what she had described. Marcus made a decision that surprised everyone, including his own family. Despite being advised by lawyers to focus on his physical recovery and avoid controversial public statements, he announced that he wanted to speak publicly about his case and support Sarah's efforts to expose the corruption at Mercy General Hospital. His status as a decorated Navy SEAL gave his words considerable weight, and media outlets that had previously ignored or downplayed the story suddenly showed renewed interest. The press conference was scheduled for the following week, but before it could take place, Sarah received a visit that would change the trajectory of the entire case. On a quiet Thursday evening, as she sat in her living room reviewing legal documents, there was a firm knock at her front door. Through the peephole, she saw a woman in a military uniform standing on her porch. The visitor introduced herself as Colonel Rebecca Hayes from the Department of Veterans Affairs Inspector General's office. She had been following the Marcus Thompson case as part of a larger investigation into healthcare discrimination against veterans across multiple states. Sarah's public stand had brought national attention to issues that the Inspector General's office had been quietly investigating for months. Colonel Hayes revealed that the corruption at Mercy General Hospital was part of a broader pattern they had identified in several cities. Hospitals that received significant donations from wealthy individuals or politically connected families sometimes provided different levels of care based on the patient's social status or potential for creating controversy. Veterans, in particular, were vulnerable because they often lacked the resources or connections to fight back against institutional bias. The Inspector General's office had been building cases against several healthcare institutions, but they needed witnesses with credibility and courage to come forward. Sarah's public stance, despite the personal cost, had made her exactly the kind of witness they needed to pursue criminal charges rather than just administrative penalties. Colonel Hayes explained that the federal government had jurisdiction in cases involving discrimination against veterans, and they were prepared to offer Sarah protection and support if she would cooperate with their investigation. This revelation reframed everything Sarah had endured over the past month. Her decision to speak out had not been in vain, and the isolation and persecution she had suffered were about to serve a much larger purpose. The federal investigation would have resources and authority that state-level inquiries lacked, and it could potentially protect other veterans from experiencing what Marcus had gone through. However, cooperating with the federal investigation would also mean that Sarah's case would become part of a much larger legal proceeding that could take years to resolve. She would need to testify before grand juries, sit through depositions, and potentially face even more intense scrutiny from defense attorneys representing the hospitals and individuals under investigation. The personal cost of her decision would continue to mount, but the potential for systemic change had suddenly become very real. Dr. Morrison, who had been considering coming forward with his testimony, found new courage when he learned about the federal investigation. He contacted Colonel Hayes directly and provided detailed information about the practices he had witnessed at Mercy General. His testimony, combined with the evidence Sarah had preserved, gave federal prosecutors the foundation they needed to pursue serious criminal charges. The news of the federal investigation sent shockwaves through Mercy General Hospital and the broader medical community. Dr. Henley suddenly found herself the subject of intense scrutiny, and several other administrators who had been involved in covering up Marcus's case began hiring criminal defense attorneys. The hospital's board of directors called emergency meetings to discuss how to respond to the federal investigation. Councilman Blackwood, whose son's accident had started the entire controversy, realized that his political career was now in serious jeopardy. Federal investigators were examining his relationship with the hospital and whether he had used his political influence to pressure the institution to cover up his son's role in Marcus's injuries. The accident that had initially seemed like a minor inconvenience was now threatening to destroy his career and reputation. For Sarah, the visit from Colonel Hayes represented both vindication and the beginning of an even more challenging phase of her fight. She would now be under federal protection, but she would also be at the center of a high-profile criminal investigation that would attract national attention. The quiet nurse who had simply wanted to do the right thing for her patient was about to become the key witness in a case that could reshape how hospitals treat veterans across the country. The federal investigation moved with surprising speed and thoroughness. Within days of Colonel Hayes's visit, FBI agents were conducting interviews throughout Mercy General Hospital, reviewing years of medical records, and examining financial relationships between the hospital and influential donors. The scope of the investigation expanded as evidence emerged of systematic discrimination that went far beyond Marcus Thompson's case. Sarah found herself at the center of a media storm that dwarfed anything she had experienced before. National news outlets picked up the story, framing it as a David versus Goliath battle between a principled healthcare worker and a corrupt medical establishment. Camera crews camped outside her house, and reporters called at all hours seeking interviews and comments. The attention was overwhelming, but it also brought unexpected support from veterans organizations, nursing associations, and civil rights groups across the country. The public revelation of the federal investigation transformed Sarah from a local pariah into a national symbol of courage and integrity. Letters of support poured in from nurses, doctors, and veterans who shared their own stories of witnessing or experiencing discrimination in healthcare settings. Many thanked her for giving them the courage to speak out about problems they had observed but had been too afraid to report. Marcus Thompson's recovery continued to progress remarkably well, and he became an active participant in the investigation. His testimony was particularly powerful because he could speak not only as a victim of the alleged discrimination, but also as someone who had served his country with distinction. His presence at press conferences and congressional hearings humanized the broader issues at stake and made it difficult for critics to dismiss the investigation as politically motivated. Dr. Morrison's decision to cooperate with federal investigators proved to be a turning point in the case. His detailed testimony about the hospital's practices provided the inside perspective that prosecutors needed to build their criminal case. Other healthcare workers began coming forward with similar stories, creating a chorus of witnesses that corroborated the allegations of systematic corruption and discrimination. The legal proceedings moved through multiple phases simultaneously. The Inspector General's office pursued administrative charges against the hospital that could result in the loss of federal funding and certification. The Justice Department developed criminal cases against individual administrators and doctors who had participated in the cover-up. State medical boards launched their own investigations that could result in the loss of medical licenses for those involved in altering records and providing substandard care. Councilman Blackwood's political career crumbled as evidence emerged of his attempts to influence the hospital's handling of his son's case. Phone records revealed multiple calls to hospital administrators immediately after the accident, and witness testimony suggested that he had explicitly threatened to withdraw political support if the hospital did not minimize his son's role in causing Marcus's injuries. He announced his resignation from the city council and withdrew from the mayoral race he had been expected to win easily. Dr. Henley and several other senior administrators at Mercy General Hospital were indicted on federal charges including conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and civil rights violations. The hospital itself faced massive fines and the potential loss of its accreditation, which would effectively shut down the institution. The board of directors announced a complete restructuring of the hospital's leadership and implemented new policies designed to prevent discrimination and ensure equal treatment for all patients. Sarah's financial situation improved dramatically as legal fees were covered by the federal government, and she received a substantial settlement from the hospital as part of a whistleblower protection claim. More importantly, job offers began arriving from hospitals and healthcare organizations across the country that wanted to hire someone with her demonstrated commitment to ethical patient care. She had become a sought-after speaker at nursing conferences and medical ethics seminars. The personal cost of her decision continued to be significant, however. The stress of testifying in multiple legal proceedings, dealing with constant media attention, and living under federal protection took a toll on her physical and emotional health. Relationships with old friends and colleagues remained strained, and she struggled with the knowledge that her actions had contributed to the downfall of people she had once worked alongside, even if their behavior had been wrong. Marcus Thompson made a full recovery and returned to active duty with the Navy SEALs. He credited Sarah with saving not just his reputation, but potentially his life, as the altered medical records could have affected his long-term medical care and military career. He established a foundation dedicated to protecting the rights of veterans in healthcare settings, and made Sarah a member of its board of directors. The case attracted attention from lawmakers in Washington, who began drafting legislation to strengthen protections for veterans receiving care in civilian hospitals. Sarah was invited to testify before congressional committees about the need for better oversight and stronger penalties for institutions that discriminate against service members. Her testimony was credited with building bipartisan support for significant healthcare reform legislation. As the various legal proceedings continued, Sarah reflected on the journey that had begun with a simple decision to stand up for what was right. The cost had been enormous, but the impact had exceeded anything she could have imagined when she first spoke out about Marcus's case. She had not set out to become a national figure or to reform the healthcare system, but circumstances had thrust her into a role that allowed her to make a difference on a scale she had never thought possible. 2 years after the investigation began, the final chapters of the case were being written in courtrooms across the country. Dr. Henley and 3 other hospital administrators were convicted on federal charges and sentenced to prison terms, ranging from 2 to 5 years. Mercy General Hospital paid over $50 million in fines and settlements, implemented comprehensive reforms, and operated under federal oversight to ensure compliance with non-discrimination policies. The ripple effects of the case extended far beyond a single hospital. Healthcare institutions across the nation reviewed their own practices and policies, fearful of facing similar federal scrutiny. Veterans advocacy organizations used the case as a catalyst to push for broader reforms in how civilian hospitals treat military personnel. The legislation that Sarah had helped support in congressional testimony was signed into law, establishing stronger protections and oversight mechanisms for veterans receiving health care in civilian facilities. Sarah had accepted a position as director of patient advocacy at a large teaching hospital in another state. Her role was specifically created to ensure that all patients received equal treatment, regardless of their background, financial status, or political connections. She worked closely with medical staff to identify potential bias in treatment decisions and served as an ombudsman for patients who felt they were not receiving appropriate care. The new position allowed Sarah to use her experience constructively while rebuilding her professional life. Her colleagues at the teaching hospital respected her integrity and valued her perspective on ethical healthcare delivery. She had found a professional home where her willingness to challenge authority when necessary was seen as an asset rather than a liability. Marcus Thompson had not only returned to full active duty but had been promoted, and was now serving as an instructor for new Navy SEAL recruits. He spoke regularly at military bases about the importance of advocating for fellow service members and not accepting discrimination or substandard treatment. His foundation had grown significantly and was now operating in 12 states, helping veterans navigate healthcare systems and providing legal support when discrimination occurred. The relationship between Sarah and Marcus had evolved into a deep friendship built on mutual respect and shared purpose. They collaborated on various projects related to veterans' healthcare rights and often appeared together at conferences and speaking engagements. Marcus credited Sarah with teaching him that sometimes the most important battles are fought not on foreign battlefields, but in everyday situations where standing up for what is right requires personal courage. Dr. Morrison had also rebuilt his career after his testimony helped convict the corrupt administrators at Mercy General. He now worked at a veterans hospital where his commitment to ethical patient care was appreciated and supported. He had become an advocate for healthcare workers who witness wrongdoing, encouraging them to speak out and offering guidance on how to report problems through appropriate channels. The case had fundamentally changed how healthcare institutions approach the treatment of veterans and other potentially vulnerable patient populations. Training programs now included specific modules on recognizing and preventing discrimination, and reporting mechanisms had been strengthened to protect whistleblowers from retaliation. The fear that had once kept healthcare workers silent about unethical practices had been replaced by a culture that encouraged speaking up when patient welfare was at stake. Sarah often reflected on the 24 hours that had transformed her life completely. The visit from Colonel Hayes had validated her decision to speak out and opened doors to opportunities she could never have imagined. But more importantly, it had shown her that individual actions could have consequences far beyond what anyone might expect when they first choose to do what is right. The personal costs of her decision had been real and significant. Some relationships had never recovered, and the stress of the legal proceedings had taken years to fully overcome. However, Sarah had gained something invaluable in return: the knowledge that she had made a difference in the lives of countless people she would never meet. Veterans across the country were receiving better health care because she had been willing to risk everything to defend one Navy SEAL's right to equal treatment. As she settled into her new role and new life, Sarah maintained contact with many of the people who had supported her during the darkest days of her fight. The network of healthcare workers, veterans, and advocates who had rallied to her cause had become a community dedicated to ensuring that the reforms they had fought for would be permanent and meaningful. The story had begun with a simple choice to stand up for a patient who could not advocate for himself. It had grown into a national movement that changed laws, reformed institutions, and saved lives. Sarah Martinez had learned that sometimes doing the right thing requires enormous sacrifice, but that the impact of principled action can extend far beyond anything one person might imagine when they first choose to speak truth to power. The nurse who had been cast out for defending a Navy SEAL had become a catalyst for change that would protect countless other veterans for generations to come.